If someone told you that the government once ran a secret program where they dosed citizens with LSD without their knowledge, hired hypnotists to test psychological manipulation, performed experiments on prisoners who didn't consent, and then destroyed all the evidence when they found out someone was paying attention, you would probably say that sounds like a conspiracy theory. And you would be right. It does sound like a conspiracy theory, except it isn't one, because it happened. All of it. And the reason we know it happened is because the government accidentally left some of the paperwork. So today we're going to talk about the most insane government mind control programs that actually happened. Not rumored, not alleged, actually happened, as confirmed by declassified documents, congressional hearings, and the occasional very uncomfortable government apology. Let's start with the most famous one, MKUltra, which sounds like the name of a villain in a Marvel movie, but was actually a real CIA program that ran from 1953 to 1973. Here is what MKUltra was in simple terms. The CIA wanted to know if they could control the human mind. Not metaphorically, literally. They wanted to find a way to make people do things, believe things, or say things against their will. The Cold War context matters here. The Soviets were doing similar research. American prisoners of war were coming back from Korea behaving strangely, giving strange confessions, saying things that didn't align with what had happened to them. The intelligence community became convinced that communist forces had found a way to break the mind, a technique, a formula. And they wanted one too. So they started experimenting. And this is where it gets deeply, fundamentally wrong, because the experiments were not conducted on willing volunteers in controlled laboratory conditions. They were conducted on prisoners, on mental patients, on drug addicts, on sex workers, on soldiers who were not told what was being given to them, and on ordinary members of the public who had absolutely no idea they were part of a government program at all. The most common substance used was LSD, which at the time was a relatively new compound and was believed by some researchers to have potential as a truth serum or a means of destabilizing a target's mental state. The CIA gave people LSD in their drinks, at parties, in hospital settings, through operatives posing as ordinary people. They watched what happened and took notes. Some subjects experienced prolonged psychosis. One subject, a civilian named Frank Olson, died after falling from a hotel window. The official story was suicide. His family spent decades arguing it was murder. The government eventually paid a settlement without admitting liability, which is a very specific kind of not admitting. Now, here's the thing that makes MKUltra even more unsettling. When the program was being shut down in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files, which means someone knew how bad it was, which means someone decided that the public finding out would be worse than the records being gone. Most of the documentation was destroyed, but some of it wasn't. In 1977, about 20,000 documents were discovered in a financial records building that had been filed incorrectly, misfiled under a budget category that Helms apparently didn't think to include in the destruction order. Those documents formed the basis of the Senate Church Committee hearings. The CIA testified. Director Stansfield Turner called the program a dark chapter in the agency's history, which is bureaucratic language for we did some genuinely horrible things and we got caught. The program had over 150 subprojects. It involved universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research facilities, many of which did not know who was actually funding the research. It involved hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and sensory isolation. They were looking for a way to break people, and in some cases, they found it. Now let's talk about a different program. COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, which sounds neutral. It was not neutral. COINTELPRO was run by the FBI from 1956 to 1971, and its goal was to monitor, infiltrate, disrupt, and discredit political organizations that the Bureau considered a threat to national security. On paper, that sounds like a reasonable law enforcement activity. In practice, it targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, feminist organizations, and anyone else that J. Edgar Hoover personally found objectionable, which was a fairly long list. The program sent forged letters designed to cause conflict within organizations. It planted informants who actively encouraged illegal activity so targets could be arrested. It sent anonymous letters to the spouses of activists accusing them of infidelity. It worked with local police departments to facilitate arrests on manufactured charges. The FBI sent Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter that many historians believe was intended to encourage him to take his own life. Let that sit for a second. The Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States of America sent a letter to one of the most significant civil rights leaders in American history that historians believe was designed to push him towards suicide. And this is not a theory. The letter was found in declassified documents. The Senate Church Committee, the same investigation that exposed MKUltra, confirmed that COINTELPRO existed and documented its operations in detail. Director Clarence Kelly, who took over the FBI after Hoover's death, acknowledged the program publicly and said that some of the activities were clearly illegal, which again is a very specific kind of confirmation. The program was officially ended in 1971 after activists broke into an FBI field office in Pennsylvania and stole classified documents, which they then mailed to journalists. Not a metaphor. Someone actually broke into a government building and stole the files that proved what the government was doing. And those files confirmed everything. Now let's talk about a different program, Project MOCKINGBIRD, which is slightly less confirmed than the previous two, but documented enough to be in the conversation. Mockingbird was a CIA program reportedly launched in the 1950s that involved cultivating relationships with journalists, editors, and media executives in order to influence what was published in major American news outlets. The idea was that if you could shape the narrative, if you could place stories, kill stories, or simply know what was coming before it was published, you could influence public opinion in ways that were invisible to the public. And the reason this is not pure speculation is that the Church Committee confirmed aspects of it. The CIA director at the time acknowledged that the agency had relationships with journalists. He drew a distinction between those relationships and direct editorial control, but the distinction was not entirely reassuring. What we know, the CIA paid journalists. The CIA placed stories. The CIA maintained relationships with media organizations that were not disclosed to the public. What we don't fully know is the scope, the specific publications, the specific stories that were the product of these arrangements rather than independent reporting, which is actually scarier in a way, because the uncertainty is the point. If you cannot tell which stories were independent and which were placed, then you cannot trust any of them fully, which is a form of influence that outlasts any specific operation. It doesn't end when the program ends. It becomes embedded in the perception of the entire institution. Now let's talk about something that is less well known. Project Artichoke, which was a precursor to MKUltra, run by the CIA from 1951 to 1953. Artichoke was specifically investigating whether the agency could create what internal documents described as a Manchurian candidate. That phrase comes from a 1959 novel and the film adaptation that followed, a story about a soldier who was captured and psychologically conditioned to become an assassin without being aware of it. And the CIA was trying to find out if that was possible. The program investigated the use of drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, and psychological pressure to determine whether a person could be conditioned to perform a specific action on command and then have no memory of it afterwards. The documents are partially redacted. The full extent of what was achieved, if anything, is not public. What is public is that the program existed, that the goal was explicitly the creation of a controllable human agent, and that the CIA considered this a serious enough line of research to fund and run for 2 years before it was absorbed into the broader MKUltra structure. Now let's step back for a moment, because there's one more program deserves to be talked about. Because MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and Mockingbird get most of the attention, but there's another one that deserves to be in the conversation. Operation PAPERCLIP, which was a post-World War II program in which the United States government secretly recruited over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians and brought them to America to work on military and intelligence programs. The scientists were given new identities. Their records were altered or classified. In some cases, their Nazi party memberships, their involvement with concentration camp experiments, and their war crimes were simply removed from their official files before they were cleared for work in the United States. Wernher von Braun, one of the most significant figures in the American space program, was a former SS officer who used concentration camp prisoners as forced labor in Germany's rocket program. He came to America. He worked for NASA. He helped put men on the moon. And for decades, his background was not publicly discussed. Now, PAPERCLIP is slightly different from the other programs on this list. It wasn't about mind control or domestic surveillance. It was about strategic advantage, the calculation that the scientific knowledge these individuals possessed was more valuable than the justice that would have followed from prosecuting them, which is its own kind of disturbing, because it means that the government looked at documented war criminals and decided useful enough to protect, and then protected them. For decades. The program wasn't fully declassified until 1999. The name paperclip was classified itself. It came from the paperclips that were used to attach the new, cleaned-up personnel files to the original dossiers, which is either brilliant or deeply on the nose, depending on your perspective. Now let's step back for a moment, because there's a pattern here. Each of these programs was classified. Each of them was eventually exposed, not because the government chose transparency, but because of leaks, accidents, congressional investigations, and persistent journalism. In each case, the initial response was denial, then partial acknowledgement, then carefully worded regret that avoids any language that could be used in a lawsuit, then, in most cases, a financial settlement that is paid without an admission of wrongdoing, which is the institutional version of "I'm sorry you feel that way." It acknowledges the outcome without acknowledging the cause. And in almost no case did the people responsible face meaningful legal consequences. Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra files and was never prosecuted for it. He later served as U.S. ambassador to Iran, which is a very specific kind of not being held accountable. Hoover ran COINTELPRO for 15 years and died in office, having never faced a single charge. The journalists whose cooperation was purchased under Mockingbird were never publicly named. The scientists brought over under paperclip worked in American institutions for decades, their histories sanitized to the point of invisibility. Which is not a minor footnote. It is actually the most important part of the story, because what these programs demonstrate is not just that the government did bad things. They demonstrate that institutions can run large, coordinated programs that are deeply harmful to their own citizens, to prisoners, to people in other countries, to historical truth, and then manage the exposure of those programs in a way that produces minimal accountability. The Church Committee hearings were significant. Senator Frank Church called the intelligence community a rogue elephant operating outside democratic oversight. The hearings resulted in new structures: the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the Inspector General Act, oversight committees in both chambers of Congress. Real reforms, but reforms designed by the same institutions that created the problems they were meant to solve. And the reforms didn't eliminate the behavior entirely. They changed the paperwork around it. Now, here's the thing about conspiracy theories. Most people encounter one of two failure modes. The first is believing everything, seeing patterns everywhere, connecting dots that aren't connected, and treating absence of evidence as evidence of a cover-up. The second is believing nothing, dismissing anything that challenges official accounts as paranoia, treating skepticism itself as a pathology. Both of those failure modes miss the actual lesson of these programs, which is not that the government controls everything, and not that the government is always trustworthy. It is that institutions have interests, and when institutional interests conflict with public accountability, institutions will protect their interests, predictably, consistently, and with considerable sophistication. That is not paranoia. That is just how large organizations work when they are not being watched closely enough, which is why the watching matters. The Church Committee worked because it had access, because people testified under oath, because documents were produced and read into the public record, because journalists were paying attention and reporting what they found. Not because the CIA suddenly developed a conscience. The conscience, when it appeared, was external, and it showed up because someone filed a FOIA request or broke into an office or misfiled some documents 20 years earlier in a financial records building, which is a deeply unsatisfying mechanism for accountability. But it is the one we have, and it works. imperfectly, slowly, incompletely when people use it. Now, here's the conclusion. The reason these stories keep coming back, the reason MKUltra is still referenced, still discussed, still the subject of documentaries and investigations decades after it ended, is not because people are paranoid. It's because the documentation exists. The files are there, the Senate transcripts are there, the settlement payments are there, the apologies, careful, calibrated, legally minimized as they are there. The difference between a conspiracy theory and a conspiracy fact is usually just time, and a misfiled box of documents in a financial records building that someone forgot to destroy, which is, in its own way, the most government thing imaginable. They ran programs to control minds, discredit leaders, manipulate the press, and import war criminals. And they were undone in the end by bad filing. Which tells you something about power. It isn't invincible. It just tends to assume it is. And that assumption, eventually, is what gets it caught. Anyway, you can subscribe.